So for example, if we want to graph and compare the functions f of x equals 2x and g of x equals 2x minus 3 in the same plane, what we're going to do works in basically the same way as what we did back in chapter 1, where, like I said, notice that we call the second function g of x, because we like to not always use f of x for everything. In some contexts, you might see that written like a subscript, f1 and f2, or you might go f, g, and h for that matter. You'll see a few different ways to write these things. Here we're starting with the most basic and understandable version. But anyway, if we want to graph functions, it's the same as graphing equations. What we need to do is evaluate our functions at some points. So we're going to evaluate f of x and g of x at values like -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, where we'll get those things for f as well as those values for g, and taking those pieces together, playing a game of connect the dot, we will end up with a pair of pictures like this, where we can see that f and g are in a lot of ways the same graph. They're very similar functions, except that g is shifted 3 units down. When we get on this in later sections, we'll define that shift as, in particular, a transformation, where there are some nice patterns that happen with specific kinds of changes. And then also, just as an added aside to be aware of, when we're talking about defining functions and we have graphs, one nice thing we can do to be able to tell if something is a function is a trick called the vertical line test, where what we do is we take a vertical line and sort of imagine slicing it across a graph, where if that vertical line hits the function twice at one point, because of the way a vertical line works, it's y equals some value. That tells us that for y equals that value, well, we get an x that corresponds to 2 points on the graph, which means that we have 2 outputs for 1 input, and thus we're not a function. So that's an easy way to tell that, for example, graphs of circles aren't functions. But from here, last big thing we're going to look at is how we can make some interpretations based on the graphs of functions.